Have you ever looked in the mirror and felt like you were staring at a stranger, not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, as if the person looking back had been living someone else's life for decades? Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who mapped the depths of the human psyche, discovered something profound about this feeling of disconnection. He found that most people spend their entire lives seeking validation, approval, and worth from external sources, never realizing that the treasure they're desperately searching for already exists within them. But here's what Jung noticed in his decades of studying the human mind. There comes a moment, a psychological threshold, when something shifts, when the soul finally says enough to the endless chase for external validation. When you cross this threshold, Jung observed, your entire relationship with yourself and the world transforms in ways that seem almost mystical. Today, I'm going to share with you the 7 unmistakable signs that you've finally learned to value yourself, as understood through Carl Jung's revolutionary insights into human psychology. These aren't just behavioral changes we're talking about. These are deep archetypal shifts that occur in the unconscious mind, rippling outward to transform every aspect of your existence. Some of these signs might surprise you. Others might make you realize you're further along this journey than you thought. And one of them, the 7th sign, reveals something so profound about human nature that Jung himself called it the ultimate goal of psychological development. The first sign that you've learned to value yourself runs deeper than most people realize. It's not about confidence or self-esteem in the conventional sense. It's about what Jung called the withdrawal of projections. Let me explain what this means through a story that might feel familiar. Imagine Sarah, a woman who spent years feeling triggered every time her colleague received praise at work. She'd find herself consumed with resentment, convinced that life was unfair, that others were receiving what rightfully belonged to her. But then something shifted. One day, instead of feeling that familiar sting of envy, Sarah found herself genuinely happy for her colleague's success. What had changed? Jung would say that Sarah had withdrawn a projection. You see, when we don't value ourselves, we unconsciously project our unlived potential onto others. We see in them what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. The colleague's success wasn't triggering Sarah because the colleague was better than her. It was triggering her because it reminded her of her own untapped potential, her own unlived greatness that she had refused to claim. When you truly learn to value yourself, you stop projecting your disowned power onto others. You stop seeing them as having something you lack and instead recognize that their light simply reminds you of your own. This is the first and most fundamental sign. You no longer feel diminished by other people's success because you've reconnected with your own inherent worth. Jung discovered that this withdrawal of projections happens gradually, usually triggered by what he called the confrontation with the shadow. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, represents all the parts of ourselves we've rejected, denied, or refused to acknowledge. When Sarah was triggered by her colleague, she was actually meeting her own shadow, the part of her that believed she wasn't worthy of recognition. The moment she learned to value herself was the moment she integrated this shadow aspect, acknowledging that yes, she too was capable of greatness, worthy of praise, deserving of success. The psychological consequence of withdrawing these projections is profound. You begin to see the world not as a place where you must compete for scraps of validation, but as a mirror reflecting back your own infinite potential. Every person you encounter becomes a teacher, showing you different aspects of what's possible for human beings, including yourself. The second sign ventures into territory that Jung considered sacred, the realm of authentic boundaries. But we're not talking about the kind of boundaries most people think of, the aggressive walls we build to keep others out. We're talking about what Jung called the differentiation of the self. This is when you naturally begin to distinguish between what is yours and what belongs to others, not through conflict, but through an inner knowing that emerges from deep self-respect. Consider Marcus, a man who for years had been everyone's go-to person for help, advice, and emotional support. He prided himself on being needed, on being indispensable. But this pattern was slowly draining his life force. Then came the shift. It wasn't dramatic or confrontational. Marcus simply began to feel in his body, in his very cells, the difference between genuine giving and compulsive rescuing. He started saying no, not from anger or resentment, but from a deep respect for his own energy and time. More importantly, he stopped taking on other people's emotional states as his own. Jung understood that when we don't value ourselves, we become what he called psychologically porous. We absorb the emotions, expectations, and problems of others because we haven't developed a strong sense of our own psychological boundaries. We mistake this absorption for compassion, but Jung recognized it as a form of unconscious identification. True compassion, he argued, can only emerge from a place of psychological differentiation, where you can be present with someone's pain without taking it on as your own. The authentic boundary setting that emerges from self-valuation is like a permeable membrane rather than a rigid wall. It allows love and connection to flow freely while filtering out what is not yours to carry. When you reach this stage, people often comment that you seem more present, more available, even though you're actually less accommodating. This paradox reveals the profound truth. When you value yourself, you have more of yourself to give to others. From Jung's perspective, this boundary-setting ability stems from what he called the development of the ego-self axis. The ego, in Jungian terms, is not the villain many spiritual traditions make it out to be. It's the conscious mind's organizing principle, the part of you that navigates daily reality. When this ego is properly connected to the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche, boundaries become natural expressions of self-respect rather than defensive reactions to threat. The third sign takes us into the mysterious realm of what Jung called the transcendent function, though it manifests in a surprisingly practical way. When you've learned to value yourself, you develop what appears to be an almost supernatural ability to hold paradox without needing to resolve it immediately. You become comfortable with contradiction, with not knowing, with the beautiful messiness of being human. Let me illustrate this through Eleanor's story. Elena had always been a perfectionist, someone who needed to have everything figured out, every decision carefully analyzed and justified. She lived in terror of making the wrong choice, of being seen as inconsistent or flawed. But as she began to value herself more deeply, something remarkable happened. She found herself able to hold two opposing truths simultaneously without the familiar anxiety. She could acknowledge that she was both strong and vulnerable, both wise and learning, both independent and in need of connection. Jung observed that most psychological suffering comes from what he called the opposites, our inability to hold contradictory aspects of our nature in conscious awareness. We split ourselves into acceptable and unacceptable parts, then spend enormous energy trying to maintain this split. When we learn to value ourselves, we begin to understand that these opposites are not enemies to be conquered, but complementary forces to be integrated. This capacity to hold paradox without anxiety is actually a sign of what Jung called psychological maturity. It means you've stopped trying to present a perfect, consistent image to the world and have begun to embrace your full humanity. You can be serious and playful, strong and tender, confident and uncertain, all within the span of a single conversation. This isn't inconsistency, it's authenticity. The transcendent function that underlies this capacity is Jung's term for the psyche's natural ability to bridge opposites and create new possibilities. When you value yourself, you stop fearing your contradictions and start seeing them as sources of creative potential. You realize that your complexity is not a bug in your programming, it's a feature. You're not meant to be one-dimensional. You're meant to be a living, breathing paradox, and that's exactly what makes you beautiful. From a spiritual perspective, this sign represents a profound shift from ego consciousness to what Jung called self-consciousness, awareness rooted in the deeper organizing principle of the psyche. When you can hold paradox comfortably, you've stopped trying to control your image and started trusting your essence. The fourth sign reveals itself in what Jung considered one of the most important aspects of psychological development: your relationship with solitude. But this isn't about becoming a hermit or avoiding social connection. It's about what Jung called the capacity for creative solitude, the ability to be alone with yourself without needing to fill the space with distraction, entertainment, or the company of others. Think about David, a man who had always defined himself through his relationships, his work, his social roles. He couldn't bear to be alone because in the silence, he encountered something that terrified him: himself. He would schedule every moment of his day, surround himself with noise, stay constantly busy, anything to avoid the confrontation with his own inner world. But as David began to value himself, the quality of his solitude transformed. Instead of being a void to be feared, solitude became a sanctuary to be treasured. Jung understood that our fear of being alone is actually a fear of meeting our authentic self. When we don't value ourselves, we experience our own company as boring, uncomfortable, or even painful. We need constant external stimulation to avoid the confrontation with our inner world. But when we learn to value ourselves, solitude becomes a source of renewal, creativity, and deep peace. This transformation happens because in valuing yourself, you begin to develop what Jung called a relationship with the unconscious. You start to see your inner world not as a chaotic mess to be avoided, but as a rich landscape to be explored. Your dreams become meaningful. Your spontaneous thoughts become interesting. Your emotions become teachers rather than tormentors. The creative solitude that emerges from self-valuation is different from mere isolation. It's an active engagement with your inner life, a conscious cultivation of your relationship with the deeper layers of your psyche. In this solitude, you're not alone. You're in communion with the vast intelligence of your unconscious mind. You might find yourself having insights that seem to come from nowhere, solutions to problems you weren't even consciously working on, creative inspirations that feel like gifts from another realm. Jung observed that many of history's greatest contributions to human knowledge and creativity emerged from individuals who had learned to value their solitude, to trust the wisdom that emerges when we stop filling every moment with external input and allow space for the deeper intelligence of the psyche to speak. From a psychological perspective, this comfort with solitude indicates that you've developed what Jung called a strong ego-self-axis. You're no longer dependent on external validation to know who you are because you've established a reliable connection with your own inner authority. This doesn't make you antisocial. It makes you more genuinely social because you're coming to others from a place of fullness rather than need. The fifth sign emerges in territory that Jung found both fascinating and crucial: your relationship with what others think of you. But this isn't about becoming callous or indifferent to feedback. It's about developing what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the ability to consider others' opinions without being enslaved by them. Let me tell you about Maria, a woman who had spent decades as what Jung might call a people pleaser. Every decision she made, every word she spoke, every choice about how to present herself was filtered through an anxious internal question: what will they think? She was like a chameleon, constantly shifting to match what she imagined others expected of her. But here's what's remarkable. As Maria began to value herself, she didn't become indifferent to others' opinions. Instead, She developed the ability to receive feedback without it fundamentally destabilizing her sense of self. Jung discovered that when we don't value ourselves, we unconsciously assign others the power to determine our worth. Their approval becomes our drug of choice, their disapproval our greatest fear. We live in a state of psychological dependency, constantly monitoring others' reactions to gauge whether we're acceptable. But when we learn to value ourselves, we develop what Jung called an inner witness, a stable internal reference point that remains consistent regardless of external approval or disapproval. This inner witness doesn't make you arrogant or dismissive of feedback. In fact, it makes you more open to genuine criticism because you're not receiving it as an attack on your fundamental worth. When someone points out your mistakes or suggests improvements, you can hear the information without it triggering existential panic about whether you're lovable or valuable as a person. Jung understood that this psychological sovereignty emerges from what he called the development of the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche that exists beyond the ego's concerns with image and approval. When you're connected to this deeper self, you naturally know your worth from the inside out. Others' opinions become interesting information rather than verdicts on your value as a human being. The spiritual dimension of this sign is profound. When you stop seeking validation from others, you create space for what Jung called the authentic expression of the self. You begin to live from your own center rather than from the imagined expectations of others. This doesn't make you selfish, it makes you authentic. And authenticity, Jung observed, is one of the greatest gifts you can offer the world because it gives others permission to be authentic as well. If you're recognizing yourself in these signs, or if this exploration of Jung's insights is resonating with something deep within you, I want to invite you to become part of our community of inner explorers. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to dive deeper into the mysteries of the human psyche, and hit that notification bell to ensure you don't miss our upcoming exploration of Jung's most profound discoveries about the path to psychological wholeness. Your journey of self-discovery is sacred work, and having companions on the path makes all the difference. The sixth sign takes us into territory that Jung considered absolutely essential for psychological health, yet it's something most people struggle with throughout their entire lives. It's your relationship with your own imperfections, your mistakes, your shadow qualities. When you've learned to value yourself, you develop what Jung called the capacity for self-compassion without self-indulgence. Consider James, a man who had spent years trapped in a cycle of perfectionism and self-attack. Every mistake became evidence of his fundamental inadequacy. Every flaw was a source of shame to be hidden from the world. He lived in constant fear of being found out, discovered as the imperfect person he knew himself to be. But as James began to value himself, something extraordinary happened. His mistakes didn't disappear, his flaws didn't magically vanish, but his relationship with them completely transformed. Jung understood that our capacity for self-acceptance is directly related to our capacity for accepting others. When we're harsh with ourselves, we inevitably become harsh with others, though we might disguise this harshness as high standards or helpful criticism. But when we learn to extend compassion to our own imperfections, we naturally become more compassionate toward the imperfections of others. This doesn't mean becoming permissive or excuse-making. Jung was very clear about the difference between self-compassion and what he called sentimental self-indulgence. True self-compassion includes accountability. It means acknowledging your mistakes without drowning in shame about them. It means recognizing your flaws without using them as evidence that you're fundamentally unworthy of love and respect. The psychological mechanism behind this transformation involves what Jung called the integration of the shadow. The shadow, remember, represents all the parts of ourselves we've rejected or denied. When we don't value ourselves, we tend to split off these shadow aspects, projecting them onto others or attacking ourselves mercilessly when they surface. But when we learn to value ourselves, we begin to understand that our imperfections are not separate from our worth. They're part of our humanity. Jung observed that this integration of imperfection actually makes us more effective in the world, not less. When you're not spending enormous amounts of energy hiding your flaws or attacking yourself for having them, you have that energy available for creativity, connection, and contribution. You become more resilient because you're not constantly destabilized by the discovery that you're human. From a spiritual perspective, this sign represents what Jung called the embrace of wholeness. You stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be whole. You recognize that your cracks are not evidence of your brokenness. They're where the light gets in. They're part of what makes you uniquely beautiful and authentically human. Now we come to the seventh sign, what Jung himself considered the culmination of the individuation process, the ultimate goal of psychological development. This sign is so subtle that many people achieve it without even realizing it. Yet its effects are so profound that it transforms not just your relationship with yourself, but your relationship with existence itself. When you've truly learned to value yourself, you develop what Jung called the capacity for creative living. This doesn't necessarily mean you become an artist or a writer, though you might. It means you begin to approach your entire life as a creative act. You stop living reactively, responding to circumstances from a place of fear or need, and start living generatively, responding to life from a place of curiosity and possibility. Let me paint this picture through the story of an ordinary woman named Catherine. Catherine worked in accounting, lived in a suburban house, had what most people would consider a completely unremarkable life. But something about Catherine was different. In the grocery store, she turned routine errands into opportunities for small acts of kindness. In conversations with friends, she asked questions that helped them discover things about themselves they'd never noticed. At work, she found ways to make mundane tasks more efficient and enjoyable, not just for herself, but for her colleagues. Catherine had developed what Jung called the creative attitude toward life. She understood that creativity isn't just about making art. It's about approaching each moment as a unique opportunity to bring something new into being. When you value yourself, you naturally trust your impulses, your intuition, your spontaneous responses to life. You stop living according to rigid scripts about how things should be done and start trusting your own creative intelligence to find fresh approaches to eternal human challenges. Jung observed that this creative approach to living emerges naturally from what he called the union of opposites within the psyche. When you've learned to value yourself, you've integrated your light and shadow, your masculine and feminine aspects, your conscious and unconscious wisdom. This integration creates what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to generate new possibilities that transcend old limitations. The spiritual dimension of this final sign is profound. When you're living creatively, you become what Jung called an individual, not in the sense of being selfish or isolated, but in the sense of being undivided, whole, authentic. You're no longer trying to become someone else or live up to external expectations. You're expressing the unique configuration of consciousness that is you, and this expression becomes a gift to the collective human experience. Jung believed that when individuals learn to live creatively from their authentic center, they contribute something irreplaceable to what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychic space of all humanity. Your unique way of being human adds to the total possible ways of being human. Your creative response to life expands the repertoire of human possibility. But here's what Jung found most remarkable about this final sign. It's not something you achieve once and then possess forever. It's a dynamic, ongoing process of becoming. Each day presents new opportunities to choose creative response over reactive habit, to trust your authentic impulses over safe conformity, to value your unique perspective over popular opinion. The journey toward truly valuing yourself is not a destination, but a process, not an achievement, but a practice. Jung understood that individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, continues throughout our entire lives. There's no final moment when you can say, "I've arrived, I now perfectly value myself." There are only moments of recognition, moments of choice, moments when you remember who you really are beneath all the conditioning and fear. If you've recognized yourself in any of these 7 signs, you're already further along this path than you might realize. If you haven't seen these signs in yourself yet, that's not cause for discouragement. Jung believed that the very desire to understand yourself more deeply is evidence that the individuation process has already begun within you. The fact that you're here, listening to this exploration of what it means to truly value yourself, suggests that something in you is ready to awaken to your own worth. The most beautiful thing about Jung's understanding of self-valuation is that it's not about becoming someone different. It's about becoming more fully who you already are. It's about removing the layers of conditioning, expectation, and fear that have obscured your authentic nature and allowing your true self to shine through. Your journey towards self-valuation might begin with something as simple as pausing before automatically saying yes to a request that doesn't align with your values. It might start with spending 10 minutes in solitude without reaching for your phone. It might emerge through the radical act of forgiving yourself for a mistake you've been carrying for years. However it begins, trust that your psyche knows how to navigate this process. Jung discovered that the human psyche has an innate wisdom, what he called the self, that naturally moves toward wholeness, integration, and authentic self-expression. As you continue on this journey, remember that learning to value yourself is not a selfish act. It's a generous act. When you value yourself, you model for others that they too are worthy of love and respect. When you stop seeking validation from others, you free them from the burden of having to provide it. When you live authentically from your own center, you give others permission to do the same. Jung saw clearly that our world desperately needs individuals who have learned to value themselves, not from ego or arrogance, but from a deep understanding of their interconnectedness with all of life. These individuals become what he called carriers of consciousness, people who help raise the level of awareness and authenticity in their families, communities, and cultures. Your worth is not something you need to earn, achieve, or prove. It's something you need to recognize, acknowledge, and honor. It was never missing. It was only obscured. The 7 signs we've explored today are not goals to strive for, but natural expressions of remembering who you really are. Trust the process, trust your journey, trust yourself. You are worthy of your own love, respect, and valuation, not because of what you do or achieve, but because of who you are. And who you are is nothing less than a unique expression of the infinite creativity of existence itself.